Movie Holics!
Hello, I am Jack Hudgens, and this is The Niche. Today I'm reeling us back into Godzilla territory, so if you haven't watched the first episode yet, you should. Have you heard of a guy named Shinichi Sekizawa before? Because you're about to. When fans, critics, or historians think of the most talented artists in the Godzilla series, they typically think of director Ishiro Honda, or special effects director E.G. Tsuburaya, or maybe Akira Ifukube for his incredible scores. And then there's Tomoyuki Tanaka, who sold Toho on the entire idea of Godzilla. He produced the first 22 Godzilla movies, so he not only created the Godzilla series, he raised it. For some reason, screenwriters are often overlooked, including the original Godzilla screenwriter, Taiko Murata.
But screenwriting, you say? Godzilla movies don't need screenwriting.
They just need monsters slugging the piss out of each other for an hour and a half, that's all. If this is your mindset, you're either not a fan or your favorite movies are from the mid to late 90s and Final Wars. I'm just kidding, guys, but really. This may come as a shock, but many of the best Godzilla movies also had, oh, wait for it, here it comes, the best screenplays. Gee, kinda sounds like any movie ever. Arguably one of the best and most versatile of Godzilla's screenwriters was Shinichi Sekizawa. Sekizawa was responsible for the stories of 10 Godzilla movies, as well as other tokusatsu, such as Mothra, and episodes of Ultraman.
Tokusei what?
Tokusatsu, guys. First episode of The Niche. It is absolutely imperative you watch the first episode. It's like the first chapter for everything in this show. I'm not going to mention it in every episode, but for the first few, if you haven't watched episode 1, I'm going to go boom, boom, boom! So Sekizawa actually started out with hopes of being an animator. He studied at the Kyoto Animation Studio with the legendary manga artist Osamu Tezuka. You could loosely compare Tezuka to Japanese comics as you would Miyazaki to Japanese animation. Sekizawa claimed that drawing comics back then probably helped me imagine all the stories in my head to visualize. Unfortunately, World War II was a thing, and Sekizawa was drafted in 1941. Although he hated the war and wanted nothing more than to go home. Imagine that. Being on South Pacific Islands really inspired his sense of adventurism. Spoiler alert, but there is a lot of islands in his screenplays. Sekizawa finally went home in 1946 and pursued a career in film that would start 2 years later. He was initially an assistant director, but his screenplay for the film Profile of the City really showed him his true calling. The man wrote that successful script in 4 days. It took me a week and a half just to jot down notes and fact check this video. In addition to his growing screenwriting duties, he would also write pop songs and TV themes. Sekizawa's first kaiju screenplay was co-written with Takeshi Kimura. It was entitled Giant Monster Baron. Baron is most widely known as Varan, the Unbelievable. Although underrated, Varan does regurgitate a lot of what we've seen in 1954's Godzilla and 1956's Rodan. But it did have some interesting ideas which would become staples in Sekizawa's giant monster screenplays. Research teams, unexplored jungles, monster-worshipping natives. This is Sekizawa to a punch. Although Varan is considered one of Toho's weaker efforts, although I'd argue otherwise, Sekizawa would be given loftier duties after the success of 1961's Mothra. Expanding on some ideas from Varan, Mothra takes us to an unexplored island with fantastical elements. We have natives that drink weird liquids that nullify radioactivity. We meet 2 tiny priestesses with wonderful singing voices. Oh yeah, and there's a giant moth god. Unlike Godzilla, Rodan, and Varan, Mothra is firmly grounded in fantasy. Mothra herself is a more fanciful, colorful creature, instead of a prehistoric nuclear survivor. Mothra's success made Sekizawa one of the major players in Toho's special effects films. Or tokusatsu. Yeah, that first episode hasn't gone anywhere, kids. Sekizawa's first crack at Godzilla came when producer John Beck came to Toho and attracted them with King Kong. What became King Kong vs. Godzilla ended up being Sekizawa's witty satire on Japanese salaryman and capitalistic opportunism. It was very far from the serious nuclear allegories of the mid-1950s. The entire point of King Kong vs. Godzilla is the absurd marquee value, and the movie's script is completely aware of it. There's even dialogue in the movie where a character says, "King Kong vs. Godzilla." Bring it home, Sekizawa. The mid-60s saw the release of some of the Godzilla series' best movies. Sekizawa wrote 3 kaiju films released in 1964 alone. Mothra vs. Godzilla, which is widely considered the best Godzilla movie after the original. Dogora the Space Monster, for anyone wondering what that jellyfish thing in the intro of my video is, and Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster. Mothra vs. Godzilla and Dogora were far more serious than King Kong vs. Godzilla, but that didn't stop Sekizawa from going nuts. Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster was closer to the jovial insanity that Sekizawa would later be known for. While his characters became as sharp as ever, Godzilla grew more anthropomorphic, going from a nuclear villain to a superhero. But this transition didn't happen over one flick. Many fans cite Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster as the film where Godzilla finally became a hero. But that's not true. It was merely the turning point. Sekizawa made sure that the transition was slow and smooth. Immediately following his sci-fi monster masterpiece, Monster Zero, Sekizawa would frame Godzilla in a more likable way. Godzilla would fight international terrorists, and then he would become a father. But through all of this, Sekizawa's characters still considered Godzilla a threat. And despite the gravity of the situation, his characters would always have sharp dialogue and biting wit to match the sort of goofier monster antics. This was especially true with Ultraman. As Sekizawa's career would slow in the late 60s and 1970s, he would wrap things up with tokusatsu. One of Sekizawa's historically misunderstood screenplays was for Godzilla's Revenge. Godzilla's Revenge is a Godzilla movie that's not about Godzilla at all. The movie is about the hardships of growing up in the late 60s Japanese Depression. The main character merely dreams about Godzilla and his son to get away from reality. Unfortunately, the amount of stock footage and the concept of a child dreaming of befriending Godzilla and his son turns a lot of fans off. It's generally and unfairly considered one of the worst Godzilla movies by fans, even though it has one of the most genuine stories in the series. In addition to the screenplays for Godzilla's Revenge and Godzilla vs. Gigan, he also wrote the theme songs that were recorded for both films. As Sekizawa's career ended, so did his ideas. Wanting to do something special for the 20th anniversary of Godzilla in 1974, producer Tomoyuki Tanaka turned to Sekizawa for a new monster. Out of ideas, he simply replied, "We've used them all." So special effects director Teruyoshi Nakano ended up creating the latest adversary, Mechagodzilla. Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla would be the last story Sekizawa would develop before his retirement in 1974. Sekizawa was not a typical screenwriter for the Godzilla series and its kin. He would often work outside his own boundaries, helping the special effects department design new monsters and create them with lighter materials. I want to emphasize the lighter materials part, which would make the monster battles more kinetic and ultimately fit his screenplays better. This sort of passion just shows how much he loved writing over-the-top stories with monsters. When asked if he liked writing this kind of material, he replied, and I quote, "Of course. I think it's a lot of fun." Director Ishiro Honda weighed in that if a movie's story was positive, or even childish, it would go to Mr. Sekizawa. Talking about his approach to that kind of screenplay, Honda would claim, "When I make a monster film, I never think that it will be for children. I want to imagine and express a story to a wide audience. But it's always children who are the most interested." I think a lot of that has to do with Sekizawa's charm, which redirected the franchise to expand its audience with humor and lighthearted action. But I don't want to make it sound like monsters and special effects are all that Sekizawa wrote. Tokusatsu was just a small part of his career, which was loaded with war dramas and comedies and romances. His most well-received screenplay was for 1959's The Big Boss, not to be confused with the 1971 Bruce Lee film with the same title. Directed by Kiichi Okamoto, The Big Boss is a crime drama about two brothers in the Yakuza pit against each other. Sekizawa would also do animated movies to take a break from his giant monster duties. I once kind of got sick of writing screenplays for monster films, so when I got an offer to write animated screenplays, I took it. So when it comes right down to it, Shinichi Sekizawa was really just a talented screenwriter, and writing monster movies was just one of those things he really excelled at. I think one of the reasons he enjoyed writing kaiju films so much was because it was an appropriate outlet for all of his positive energy. After World War II, he just wanted to live life to its fullest, and you can see his joy radiating through the Godzilla movies that he wrote. Furthermore, his penchant for fun adventures really prolonged Godzilla's life, even if some fans prefer the
darker, more serious Godzilla films.
The only reason we have some of those today is because Sekizawa opened up the franchise to a much larger audience. And say what you will about the campy nature of some of his screenplays, most of them are still light years better than anything that came after the 80s. I want to cite David Callett, Steve Reifel, and August Rogone for much of this information. They're the historians that dug much of this stuff up. I'm just passing it along. So what do you think of Shinichi Sekizawa? Are you a fan of his work? Do you feel a need to revisit it? And if you've never seen a movie that he's worked on, are you interested? Let me know this stuff in the comments below. In the meantime, thanks for playing along. Make sure you subscribe to Movie Holics for more episodes of The Niche. Also follow Movie Holics on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and SoundCloud, and make sure you visit their website, movieholics.net. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at gmanonsci-fi. And if you're interested in more of this stuff, check out my website, Sci-Fi Tokusatsu. It's in the description right down there. And you are now leaving the niche. Tread lightly everywhere else. Later.